Joining us for the must-read opinion page is former governor of Vermont and former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Howard Dean, and editor of the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol, join us as well. Dorian Warren's still with us, along with Joe and me. I want to read from Mike Barnacle's piece in the Daily Beast. Any outrage out there for Ramos and Lou? Now, during Christmas week, many of the politicians and phony posers who have labeled all cops as dangers because of the behavior of a few will pay their respects to two who died in Brooklyn, ambushed, never even drawing their service revolvers. They will do this without realizing the tragic irony involved in paying respects to the police who barely ask more than exactly that, respect for what they are asked to do and what they represent to a society seeking order and peace. So let's start off the conversation about this by asking you, Bill Kristol, inflammatory rhetoric, was it at all responsible in part for the deaths of the two police officers?
I mean, who knows? You'd have to understand the murderer's, inner workings of his mind, which I certainly don't pretend to. But the inflammatory rhetoric is a bad idea, and certainly inflammatory rhetoric inflames people, or could inflame people, and should be denounced in its own right. It's not healthy for a society to have marches.
But you don't think there's any connection, given the fact that he said, he referred to Garner and.
Right, he said
others.
he said there was some connection, but I think on the whole one wants to hold the individuals responsible for crimes. But I think the atmosphere and the irresponsible statements by a lot of political leaders tarring the police forces of the nation, policemen in general, I think Mayor de Blasio should apologize for what he said. I mean, he really did stir things. There's just no question about that.
You don't think what he said was more conciliatory, more
No, I meant what he said originally, I mean.
Well, let me just interrupt here. And look, this is a long history of police activity in the minority communities, which can't be denied. So, is there a lot of overheated rhetoric? Of course there's a lot of overheated rhetoric. You have two different groups of people coming from a different place who see the same event in a very different way. And I think we have to understand that. This is a horrible moment, obviously, for these two guys who were killed in cold blood. First of all, the assailant was clearly crazy. Yep. So to say that maybe there's a connection and maybe there isn't, overheated rhetoric always makes crazy people act out. I mean, we've seen this again and again and again.
So in part it was.
Yeah, but okay, so you shouldn't say anything bad because somebody who's crazy might do something like this?
You shouldn't march around, you surely agree with this, chanting death to the cops.
There's no question about that.
People shouldn't lend their moral authority to such marches.
Well, I would hope that, I don't see any evidence that anybody lended any moral authority to that kind of stuff. But listen, the point I'm trying to make is this. I'm a child of the 60s. I can remember what this was like in the 60s. Even despite the horrible events of yesterday, or the day before, we are having a much better conversation than we used to have. For the white police chief of Ferguson, after the Michael Brown death, to say one of the problems, or it was the mayor, excuse me, is that we have a police force of 53 people, 3 of whom are African American, and our population is 70%. They recognize it instantly. So we are ahead of the game. Everybody feels terrible about all the stuff that's going on, and we should. But we are having a better conversation now, 40 years later, than we were before. And we have to realize that the blame game does not work. We should stop doing it. That goes for the head of the police union, as well as the mayor, as well as everybody else.
All right, Joe, and then Dorian. Joe?
Bill Kristol, I was reminded again of how young men who went off to Vietnam in the 1960s and did what they were not only asked to do, but ordered to do by draft boards. Did their job, risked their lives, left their families, left their children, left their wives, left their hometowns, and came back and were spit upon. Right. And America woke up 10, 20 years later and said, oh my God, we can't believe we acted that way. I feel like we're doing the same thing to cops now because of the acts of a few. We are denigrating an entire police force that keeps America safe.
Well, that's what I object to. Mayor de Blasio made it seem like the New York police force routine is full of racists when he talked about how he had to teach his son to be wary of cops. Crime is down, and it's one of the great achievements, actually, of the last 20 years, to get crime down to the degree it's down. That has helped all New Yorkers, and it's helped Americans, actually,
he told his son to be wary of how he behaves around cops, and I think that is a universal story that applies to a lot of fathers of black sons.
Fine, and maybe he should just tell his son that privately if he feels it's appropriate. I don't think his son's going to be in a lot of trouble. But he does not have to say it publicly.
Yes, he does.
No, I'm sorry, he does not.
He has to say it publicly because it's true.
Actually, this is an important question, though,
the
Howard
cops
Dean.
routinely are going around
Hold on one
picking on
second,
people.
guys. Hold on one second. This is an important discussion to have, and Mika, let's have it right now. Just because it's true, does the mayor of New York City have to say it? It's one thing for Howard Dean to say it. He has. It's one thing for me to say it. I have. It's one thing for you to say it. You have. I guess the question is, there are a lot of things, Howard, as governor, that you knew were true, but you knew as governor you couldn't say. But you could say it on TV. Maybe it's not the smart thing for a New York City mayor to say that in press conferences.
Joe,
that's fair to say,
we don't
right?
make progress unless we confront really difficult, hard truths. Look, I'm not attacking the police department at all. I mean, I was pretty pro-law enforcement when I was governor. But this is a really hard issue, and if we don't talk about it, it doesn't get better. And I think, even despite, again, as I said before, these horrible events of this last 4 months, it is better than it was 40 years ago. We can't make it better unless we talk about difficult things.
Bill Kristol, it's being talked about. Does the mayor really have to talk about it?
Look, I don't approve of what the mayor said, and I don't approve of what a lot of other people have said, and the kind of embrace of Al Sharpton by the mayor and by the president, I think, was a mistake, given his rhetoric. So, and given his past rhetoric and past performances, and given his current rhetoric. So, people have to be held responsible for what they say. I'm not saying anyone's responsible for what happened on this terrible thing that happened on Saturday, obviously, to Officer Ramos and Officer Liu. I do want to say one other thing, though. I'm glad that we, in this show, when I was watching the previous segment, have been talking about these two officers as human beings. I was very struck by the first coverage. Obviously, when these other people were killed, and, you know, very unfortunately, obviously, Mr. Gardner and others, everyone was interested in who they were, and they were biographies of them and so forth. These officers, for the first 24 hours, were treated as, you'd see the two police officers killed. And it took, you know, way into the story to actually see anything, what their names were.
Their humanity.
Yeah, and in that respect, I'm glad that we've talked about these people. I think they deserve the tribute of being remembered as human beings, as individuals, not just as generic police officers.
We worry that we've lost, actually, that side of the story in light of all these conversations about brutality and police being excessive. Dorian, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think from this point, in terms of trying to have the conversation and move it forward, I think people on both sides of the badge are grieving. And I think actually that grief could serve as a place to start, because we have all experienced loss of some time. We are all grieving here, no matter where you stand. And I think that's the place to move the conversation forward, to come together as a community, as New Yorkers, as a nation, to say we can all grieve. We all are, any death, any unjust death is wrong. Any unjust death is wrong. And what's the way to move forward in terms of the policy discussion, not to personalize the criticisms that people have legitimately raised, and not to lump them in with the crazies out there who did have those chants, right? That's not the vast majority of people, and people of good intention and well-meaning people who want a safe community and who can also support cops. I have law enforcement in my family. I'm sure a lot of people have law enforcement in their families, and we respect and love the work of cops. But we also have to move forward, and I think the commonplaces are mutual grieving in this moment.
And talking about the policies, Howard and Bill, stay with us if you can. What exactly is a proportional response, as the president put it, to a bunch of North Korean hackers spilling in movie studio secrets? National security correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger, joins us with new reporting on that ahead.